the letters my father left behind in the floorboards. And I still remember the exact moment the old oak floorboard gave way beneath my boot, releasing a cascade of yellowed envelopes that my father had spent a lifetime making sure no one would ever read. Arthur Miller's house on Maple Street in Ashwood had always felt like a fortress of quiet certainty. After he passed away at 82, leaving the drafty, Victorian to me, his only son, Thomas, I figured the hardest part of the inheritance would be sorting through decades of accumulated tools, spare, hardware, and boxes of faded photographs from hardware store openings and local high school football games. I had lived away from Ashwood for nearly 15 years, building a predictable life as a high school history teacher 2 counties over, returning only for holidays and brief summer visits. But when my marriage quietly dissolved into an amicable exhaustion and my father's heart finally gave out after a stubborn autumn of refusing to slow down, I found myself back in the town where everyone knew my grandfather's name and half the houses still had door frames built by my great-uncle's carpentry crew. The sun was cutting long, amber blades across the dust-molded living room when the wood groaned under my weight near the base of the brick fireplace. It wasn't a normal creak. It was a hollow, sliding snap like dry pine yielding to a hidden compartment. I crouched down, setting my coffee mug on the braided rug, and pried up the warped edge of the plank with a flathead screwdriver. Beneath it lay a dark, cedar-lined cavity that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and peppermint, scents I hadn't associated with my father since I was 10 years old. Inside sat a bundle of heavy linen weave envelopes, bound together with dried twine, each one addressed in my father's sharp, architectural handwriting. The top envelope didn't have a name on it. It just had a date written in bold, black ink, October 14th, 1974. Exactly 3 days before I was born. My fingers trembled slightly as I untied the twine. Outside, a blue jay scolded from the crook of the ancient maple tree in the front yard, the sound sharp against the absolute stillness of the empty house. I pulled the first letter, free, unfolding the thick stationery, and began to read words that would slowly dismantle every single assumption I had ever held about the man who raised me, the town I grew up in, and the sudden, unexplained departure of the woman I had always been told was my mother. Thomas, if you are reading this, it means the house has finally given up its secrets, or you finally decided to fix that damn floorboard like I told you. To back in 98. The ink was slightly faded at the margins, but the voice stamped onto the page was unmistakably my father's, dry, practical, yet carrying an underlying current of gravity that made my throat tighten. I sat back on my heels against the dusty floorboards, the morning light shifting across the room as the minutes bled away. Arthur Miller had never been a man of excessive words. Growing up, our conversations across the scarred oak kitchen table were measured in nods, short sentences about the weather, and discussions on the proper way to plane a cedar board. Affection wasn't spoken. It was hammered into place. When my mother vanished or died, as the vague family lore always drifted, when I was just a toddler, my father built an impenetrable wall around the subject. Ask once, get a stern look and a reminder that we had each other and didn't need ghosts. Cluttering up the kitchen, now, holding a letter dated 3 days before my birth, I realized the ghost had a name, Clara, according to the letter. Clara hadn't died of a sudden illness in a distant hospital in Philadelphia. The quiet lie my father had maintained for decades to anyone who dared ask in the hardware store or down at St. Luke's Parish. She had walked out the front door of this very house on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, leaving behind a suitcase, a note that my father claimed he burned, sight unseen, and a town that was beginning to ask too many questions about the Miller family's sudden financial troubles. My chest grew tight. I looked up from the page, my eyes scanning the faded, floral wallpaper of the living room, picturing a young woman standing right, where I was looking at a younger version of my father with fear or desperation. in her eyes. Why would Arthur Miller lie for 40 years? What did her leaving have to do with the town of Ashwood? Before I could process the weight of the revelation, a sharp, heavy knock echoed from the front porch. It wasn't a polite tap. It was a firm, authoritative rap of someone who believed they owned the property they were standing on. I set the letter down carefully on the bare floor, feeling a sudden spike of adrenaline. Nobody knew I was here yet. I hadn't even called the local utility company to switch the power into my name. Stepping over the exposed floor, joists, I walked through the dim hallway, the old floorboards groaning under my boots, and reached for the brass doorknob. When I pulled the heavy oak door open, standing on the porch was an elderly woman leaning slightly on a carved maple cane, her sharp, intelligent eyes peering at me from beneath the brim of a wool hat. It was Martha Carter, who had lived across the street since the Eisenhower administration and still kept ledger books of every birth, death, and scandal in Ashwood. "Well, it's about time someone opened this door," Martha said, her voice dry and crackling like autumn leaves. "I saw your car parked out back an hour ago. Thomas, I came over to tell you that you've got people looking in your windows who shouldn't be, and if you have any sense left in that head of yours, you'll look behind the grandfather clock before you talk to a single soul from the bank." I stood frozen in the doorway, my hand still gripping the cold brass knob, staring at Martha Carter. The morning breeze carried the distant scent of burning leaves from somewhere down Maple Street, but the chill that ran down my spine had nothing to do with the October weather. "Excuse me, Martha," I managed, my voice sounding tighter than I intended. "People looking in my windows?" Martha stepped past me uninvited, her rubber-tipped cane clicking rhythmically against the hardwood of the entryway. She didn't look like a frail octogenarian. She moved with the calculated precision of someone who had survived 40 years of Ashwood gossip and local politics by always staying 3 steps ahead of the curve. She walked straight into the living room, her eyes sweeping over the exposed floor joists and the open cedar compartment where I had just laid out my father's letters. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her breath hitched, a rare loss of composure for a woman who had once calmly corrected the town mayor during a heated town council budget vote. "You found them," she whispered, her voice losing its previous edge, replaced by something resembling sorrow. "I dropped a boot heel," I said, stepping behind her, blocking her view of the handwritten pages just enough to reclaim a shred of privacy. "What are you talking about, Martha? Who was looking in the windows? And what does the bank have to do with any of this?" Martha turned her head slowly, looking up at me with eyes that suddenly seemed intensely tired. "The bank, Thomas, has never truly owned this house. Your father paid off the original mortgage in 1982, right after the mill closed down. But 2 years ago, right when Arthur's health started failing, Mr. Henderson from the Ashwood Savings and Trust started coming around, here late at night, carrying folders, asking questions about the property deed. My mind raced back to my father's final months. When I drove down from my apartment to visit him on weekends, he had been increasingly paranoid, muttering about clearing the ledger and keeping the land in the family. I had written it down to the early fog of dementia. Now, looking at the cedar compartment and the stack of letters, a sickening realization began to form in my chest. Why would the bank care about this house? I asked, my voice dropping an octave. "It's an old Victorian on a standard quarter lot. It's worth a decent sum of money now with the new highway development coming through, but—" "It's not about the house, Thomas," Martha interrupted, pointing her cane sharply toward the base of the brick fireplace. "It's about what sits underneath, the foundation. Your grandfather didn't just build this place with timber and nails. In 1931, during the bank panic, your family held the deeds to half the commercial block on Main Street. And when Clara left, she didn't just walk out with a suitcase. She walked out with the original covenants. Before I could ask what a set of 50-year-old property covenants had to do With a modern bank manager snooping around my windows, a sharp metallic sound cut us off from the kitchen. It was a back screen door, latching shut. Martha froze, her hand gripping the top of her cane so hard her knuckles turned. Wait. I didn't hesitate. I bolted down the narrow hallway, stepping over the drop cloths, and burst into the kitchen just in time to see a tall, sharply dressed man in a charcoal wool suit stepping off the back porch and onto the overgrown gravel driveway, clutching a manila folder under his arm. "Hey!" I shouted, kicking the screen door open and stepping out into the crisp morning air. "Who the hell are you?" The man stopped. He turned slowly around, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, and offered a cool, perfectly rehearsed corporate smile that looked entirely out of place in Ashwood. "Mr. Miller," Arthur Henderson said smoothly, taking a step toward the porch. Steps. I was told the estate was still in probate. I didn't realize anyone was actually living here yet. I'm just here to discuss the routine municipal assessment on the property boundary. Nothing to alarm yourself over. I stared down at Arthur Henderson from the elevated wooden porch, the morning sun glinting off the lenses of his wire-rimmed glasses. He stood by the edge of the overgrown gravel driveway, looking far too composed for a man who had just been caught trespassing behind a deceased local's home. "A municipal assessment," I repeated, my voice flat, carrying a dangerous edge that surprised even me. At 8:30 in the morning, through the back window, Henderson didn't flinch. He adjusted the strap of his leather briefcase, shifting the manila folder securely under his arm. "The county assessor's office has been swamped with the new highway rezoning proposals, Mr. Miller. Property lines near Maple Street are complicated. Many of the original plots overlap with commercial zones downtown. I simply wanted to verify the physical dimensions before the bank finalizes the municipal filings next week." "The bank," I said, descending the 2 wooden steps until I was standing just a few feet from him on the gravel. "My father's house isn't tied to any commercial zone, Henderson. It's residential. It has been for 70 years. "Things change, Thomas." A voice called out from behind us. I turned my head to see Martha Carter standing on the porch, leaning heavily on her cane, her sharp eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "And men like Arthur Henderson only get interested in residential property when there's a loophole big enough to drive a timber truck through. Tell him about the west boundary. Arthur, tell him about what your grandfather tried to pull back in 56. Before Arthur's dad put a stop to it with a shotgun and a handshake, Henderson's polite corporate smile flickered for a fraction of a second, just long enough for a muscle to twitch near his jawline. But he recovered quickly, turning his gaze back to me with an expression of patronizing sympathy. "Mrs. Carter is a fixture of this town, Thomas, and like many long-time residents, she tends to confuse local folklore with legal reality," Henderson said smoothly, taking a slow step back toward his late-model sedan parked by the hedge. "If you change your mind about reviewing the estate paperwork before it goes to probate court, my office is open. Otherwise, the bank will have to proceed with the standard acquisition protocol for abandoned collateral." "Abandoned?" I took a sharp step forward, my blood boiling. "I'm standing right here. A house isn't lived in just because someone turns a key, Mr. Miller," Henderson said softly. He turned, opened the driver's side door of the sedan, and slid inside without another word. The engine purred to life with a quiet, expensive hum, and a moment later, he was backing down the narrow gravel drive, kicking up a small cloud of amber dust. I stood there in the middle of the driveway, my fists clenched at my sides, watching the taillights disappear down Maple Street. "Don't let him rattle you, boy," Martha said, walking carefully down the porch, steps to join me on the gravel. "Arthur Henderson has wanted this piece of earth since he took over the bank from his uncle. His family has never forgiven your father for winning that timber lawsuit back when Eisenhower was in office." I looked down at the elderly woman, my mind reeling from the sheer density of history hidden beneath the quiet surface of Ashwood. What lawsuit, Martha? What? Does any of this have to do with my mother leaving? Martha sighed, looking out toward the abandoned mill at the end of the street, where the rusted iron smokestack cut a jagged line against the graying morning. Clouds. Everything Thomas, she murmured. Clara didn't run away because she didn't love you. She ran away because she found out what your father was protecting you from, and she knew the bank would stop at nothing to get it back. I looked from Martha's weathered face back toward the dark, empty doorway of the house, where my father's letters lay waiting under the warped floorboard. The morning air suddenly felt heavy, charged with the history I had spent my entire adult life trying to ignore by living 2 counties away. Step inside, Martha, I said quietly, the anger draining out of me, replaced by a cold, hollow determination. If you know what's in those letters, or what Henderson is looking for, you're going to tell me right now. Martha didn't argue. She tapped her cane against the gravel and slowly made her way back up the steps, her joints clicking with every movement. I followed her inside, closing the heavy oak door behind us and sliding the iron deadbolt home. With a solid, echoing thunk, we returned to the living room. Martha lowered herself carefully onto the edge of a faded armchair while I dropped to one knee beside the cedar compartment, lifting the second envelope from the bundle. The date on this one was stark. November 2nd, 1974, 2 weeks after my birth, and 2 weeks after my mother supposedly vanished into thin air. I slid the heavy paper out, my fingers steady now, and began to read aloud under the dim, dust-filtered light of the Victorian window. Thomas, if you're holding this, Clara didn't come back. I prayed every night for 3 years that she would walk through that door, that the fear would loosen its grip on her heart. But she stayed gone. They told her at the diner that we were ruined. They told her the bank was going to take the land, the house, and everything your grandfather built with his bare hands after the war. But they lied to her, son. They didn't want the land for the timber. They wanted it because of what's at 60 feet below the western well. I stopped reading, my voice catching my throat. I looked up at Martha. Her eyes were fixed on the braided rug, her hands folded tightly over the handle of her cane, 60 feet below the western well. I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. What is my father talking about, Martha? Is there an oil lease? Mineral rights? Martha let out a dry, humorless chuckle that sounded like stones rattling in a tin can. Oil? No, Thomas. Ashwood doesn't have oil. What your grandfather found down there when he was digging the foundation back in the 30s wasn't natural resources. It was a paper trail. The original land grants signed by the state legislature that proved the Ashwood Savings and Trust, back when it was run by Henderson's grandfather, illegally foreclosed on half the town's homesteads during the Great Depression using forged signatures. The silence in the room became absolute. The old house seemed to hold its breath. Around us, the exposed wooden beams settling with a faint, ghostly groan. Forged signatures, I whispered, the puzzle pieces violently snapping together. In my mind, that's why Henderson was looking in the windows. That's why he's trying to force the estate into probate before I can settle the property. He doesn't want you to find the master ledger, Martha said, looking up, her gaze piercing and fierce. And your father spent 50 years keeping it hidden, right beneath your feet, because he knew that if the bank got their hands on those documents, every family in Ashwood, including mine, including yours, would lose whatever scrap of dignity we have left. Before I could answer, a sharp, metallic screech echoed from the front of the house. I spun around on my heel just as the front living room window, the large, double-pane glass facing Maple Street, exploded inward in a blinding shower of glittering shards. A heavy, jagged rock rolled across the hardwood floor, coming to a dead stop right beside my father's cedar compartment, leaving a ragged hole in the glass through which a biting autumn wind instantly began to whistle. I dropped low instinctively, my hands flying up to shield my face as safety. Glass showered across the braided rug and scattered over the yellowed envelopes of my father's letters. "Get down!" I yelled, scrambling across the floor toward Martha's armchair. The elderly woman didn't cower. She gripped her cane like a weapon, her eyes fixed entirely on the jagged hole in the center of the shattered front window. Through the broken glass, the gray street outside was empty, save for a rustling oak tree and a single faded red pickup truck idling halfway down the block, its exhaust puffing white clouds into the crisp morning air. "Cowards," Martha muttered, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage, rather than fear. "That's Samuel Henderson's grandson all over. Too cowardly to face you across a courtroom, so he resorts to brick throwing in the daylight." "That wasn't a warning, Martha," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs as I stood up slowly, brushing tiny shards of glass off my jeans. "That was a distraction." The words had barely left my mouth when a heavy, muffled thud echoed from the back of the house, the distinct sound of the kitchen cellar doors being forced open from the outside. My breath caught. The cellar doors led directly from the weed-choked backyard into the damp, stone-lined foundation beneath the floorboards, right where the master ledger and my father's hidden documents were resting. "Stay here," I ordered, my voice dropping into a low, uncompromising register. "Don't be a fool, Thomas," Martha snapped, leaning forward. "You don't have a weapon." "I have a deadbolt and a heavy piece of iron pipe in the tool shed," I muttered, already moving. I didn't run down the hallway. I walked with deliberate, heavy steps, keeping low as I neared the kitchen. The house was freezing now, the cold October wind howling straight through the shattered front window and sweeping through the open rooms. As I reached the kitchen threshold, the creak of heavy iron hinges, groaning against old stone, echoed up from the cellar stairs. Screech. Someone was down there in the dark. I stepped silently onto the linoleum floor, my eyes scanning the kitchen, counters for anything I could use. A heavy cast-iron skillet sat cold on the back burner. I wrapped my hand around its thick iron handle, lifting it with a satisfying balance weight. The cellar door creaked wider, and a pair of dusty work boots appeared on the bottom step, followed by the hem of dark trousers. A man's heavy breathing drifted up into the kitchen, smelling faintly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap leather. "I know you're up there, Miller." A gruff, unfamiliar voice hissed from the shadows of the stairwell. "Hand over the cedar box from under floorboards. And Henderson says the bank clears your father's back taxes. Otherwise, this house gets condemned by noon." I gripped the cast-iron skillet tighter, my knuckles turning white, and stepped right up to the dark, open mouth of the cellar stairs, waiting for the intruder to take one more step up into the light. "You've got about 3 seconds to tell me who sent you before I introduce this skillet to your jaw," I said, my voice echoing down the damp stone stairwell, with a cold, flat certainty that left no room for argument. The man froze on the second step up from the dark. I could see the silhouette of his broad shoulders blocking the dim light, filtering down from the small, high cellar window. He was wearing a faded canvas work jacket, the kind worn by the laborers who maintained the county roads. For a second, nobody moved. The only sound was the distant whistle of the wind, blowing through the shattered front window in the living room. "You think you're pretty smart, don't you, Miller?" the man muttered, his voice rough and gravelly, like he had spent 40 years swallowing sawdust. He didn't sound like a corporate bank employee. He sounded like a local heavy hire to do dirty work for men who wore expensive suits. "Henderson runs this town. He runs the council. He runs a tax assessor. And he damn sure owns a mortgage on this rotting pile of timber. You can't fight a bank with a frying pan." "Try me," I said, taking half a step closer to the edge of the stairs, raising the heavy iron skillet. "And let's see how much Henderson pays your dental." "Bill," the man cursed under his breath, shifting his weight. For a heartbeat, I thought he was going to lunge upward. But then he backed down the stairs, his heavy boots scraping sharply against the stone. "Keep your little letters, Miller," He snarled from the darkness below. The probate judge signs a foreclosure notice at noon. By tonight, you won't even have a key to turn in this door. A moment later, the heavy wooden cellar doors slammed shut from the outside, followed by the metallic click of a heavy padlock sliding into place. The dull thud of footsteps faded away across the overgrown gravel toward the alley. I stood there in the quiet kitchen for a long moment, my chest heaving, the cast-iron skillet still clutched tightly in my hand. Then I turned and walked back to the living room, where Martha Carter was sitting upright in her armchair, looking remarkably calm given that a brick had just flown through the window. "He lock you in?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "He locked the cellar doors on the outside," I said, setting the skillet down on the kitchen counter with a heavy clang. "And he just confirmed what you said. The bank is forcing an emergency probate hearing at noon today. They're going to seize the house before sunset." Martha tapped her cane against the floor. "Then we don't have time to read every letter your father wrote. Thomas, we need the one from October 20th, 1974. That's the day your mother's signature was notarized at the county courthouse before she disappeared." My eyes darted back to the open cedar compartment under the floorboards. I dropped to my knees again, my fingers frantically sorting through the heavy linen envelopes until my eyes caught the date scrawled in my father's sharp handwriting. October 20th, 1974. I pulled it out, ripped the flap open, and unfolded the paper, my eyes scanning the dense, urgent paragraphs as Martha watched in tense silence. "To whoever reads this, and God willing, it's my son," the letter began, the ink slightly smeared as if a drop of water or sweat had fallen onto the page decades ago. If Henderson's people have pushed the issue, it means they finally realized the original 1,931 land trust documents were never destroyed in the mill fire. They were moved, not hidden in the bank vault, but recorded under a separate municipal parcel that your grandfather deeded directly to Clara before we were even married, to protect her from her own family's debts. When the bank panicked during the Depression, Samuel Henderson's father forced signatures on false foreclosures. Clara found the ledger in the bank basement when she worked there as a teller in 73. She didn't run away because she was scared of me, Thomas. She ran away because they threatened to frame her for forgery if she didn't hand over the deeds. I helped her cross the state line to keep her safe, and we agreed she had to stay gone, so they'd never trace the papers back to our bloodline. She's alive, son. She's lived in Altoona under her maiden name, Miller Les Hayes, all these years, thinking I hated her for leaving. The paper trembled in my hand. The room seemed to tilt slightly. My mother wasn't dead. She hadn't abandoned me out of coldness or neglect. For 42 years, I had carried a dull, quiet ache in my chest, believing the woman who brought me into the world had simply chosen a life without us. And my father, stubborn, stoic, Arthur Miller, had spent his entire life playing the villain to the town of Ashwood, taking the whispers and the isolation upon himself, just to keep two secrets safe: the bank's historic corruption and the whereabouts of a woman he never stopped loving. "Altoona," Martha whispered, leaning forward, her sharp eyes catching the name. "In my line of sight, Clara is in Altoona? By God, everyone in Ashwood thought she took off to Chicago with a traveling salesman. Arthur kept that quiet for half a century. He didn't want the bank to find her," I said, my voice thick, tears suddenly burning the backs of my eyes. "If they found her, they could force her to sign away the original land parcels under threat of reopening an old felony charge." I looked down at the letter, then at the cedar compartment, where the heavy, leather-bound master ledger sat beneath a false bottom. I reached in, my fingers brushing against the cold leather, and lifted the true ledger out into the light. It was heavy, packed with onion skin paper, legal seals, and signatures, stamped in purple notary ink from 1931. "What time is it, Martha?" I asked, my voice suddenly razor-sharp. Martha pulled a small, silver pocket watch from her cardigan and flipped the cover open. 10:15. Probate court starts at 12 sharp down at the municipal building. Judge Holloway is an old drinking buddy of Arthur Henderson. If you walk in there without legal representation, Henderson will have the house seized and bulldozed by nightfall. I stood up, sliding the leather ledger and my father's letters into my canvas backpack, zipping it shut with decisive rasp. "We're not going to court to beg for an extension," I said, walking toward the broken front window, stepping over the glass. "We're going to give Judge Holloway something he can't ignore." Martha smiled, a sharp, dangerous, beautiful grin that made her look 30 years younger. She pushed herself up from the armchair, gripping her cane firmly. "Well, what are we waiting for, Thomas?" she said, heading for front door. "Let's go wake up Ashwood." The drive down Maple Street toward the Ashwood Municipal Building took less than 3 minutes, but every second felt like a compressed lifetime. The autumn wind whistled through the jagged hole of the passenger window I'd temporarily patched with cardboard and duct tape, kicking up a low, rhythmic thrum inside the cab of my truck. Martha sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead through the cracked windshield with the expression of a general heading into a decisive battle. "Don't let Henderson speak first," Martha instructed, not taking her eyes off the road ahead. "Holloway likes to rush through probate hearings before lunch so he can make his tea time at the country club. If you let Henderson frame this as an abandoned estate with unpaid back taxes, Holloway will bang his gavel before you can pull a single page out of that backpack. I have the original 1931 land trust ledger, Martha," I replied, keeping my hands locked firmly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, "and my father's sworn letters detailing the coercion. If Holloway ignores that, it's straight-up conspiracy. Holloway doesn't care about law, Thomas. He cares about property tax revenue. And keeping the town council happy," Martha retorted dryly. "You hit him with the hard evidence right out of the gate. Make him read the notary seal with his own eyes." We turned off Maple Street onto Main Street, the historic heart of Ashwood. The town looked much as it had when I was a boy. The brick storefronts with their faded awnings, the dry goods store, the corner pharmacy where Mr. Green still sold cherry phosphates, and towering over it all, the grand, imposing limestone facade of the Ashwood Municipal Building and Savings Trust Complex. I pulled my truck right up against the curb, directly behind Arthur Henderson's slate gray sedan. As I killed the engine, I looked over at the passenger seat. Martha reached out and touched my wrist, her skin dry and warm, her grip surprisingly firm. "Your father was a stubborn, impossible man," Martha said softly, her eyes softening behind her spectacles. "He carried a burden that would have crushed 3 ordinary men. Make sure it wasn't for nothing." I gave her a firm nod, reached back to zip my canvas backpack securely, and pushed my door open. The courtroom on the second floor of the municipal building smelled of old paper, floor wax, and decades of stale bureaucratic tension. It was a high-ceiling room with dark mahogany benches and tall, arched windows that looked out over the town square. True to Martha's prediction, Judge Thomas Holloway, a heavy-set man with silver hair and a perpetually bored expression, was already sitting behind the elevated oak bench, shuffling through a stack of papers. Arthur Henderson sat at the plaintiff's table to the right, whispering something to a sharp-looking younger man in a tailored charcoal suit, evidently the bank's corporate attorney. As the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind Martha and me, Henderson looked up. His eyes widened slightly in genuine surprise when he saw me walking down the center aisle, but he recovered instantly, flashing that smooth, practiced, corporate smile. "Ah, Mr. Miller," Henderson said smoothly, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. "Glad you could make it. We were just about to ask the judge for a default summary judgment on the Maple Street property." Judge Holloway looked over his reading glasses, frowning slightly as he peered down at me. "Are you representing yourself, young man? This is a formal probate hearing regarding the abandonment of historical parcel 17. I didn't answer right away. I walked right past Henderson's table, dropped my canvas backpack onto the wooden defense table, and unzipped it with sharp, echoing rasp that cut through the quiet courtroom. "Parcel 17 isn't abandoned, Your Honor," I said, my voice ringing clear and steady against the high ceiling. "And it doesn't belong to the bank. It belongs to the people whose signatures were forged on these documents back in 1931. Henderson's smile vanished instantly. His attorney leaned forward, whispering an urgent warning in his ear, but it was already too late. I pulled the heavy, leather-bound master ledger from my bag and slammed it down onto the oak table with a sound that made Judge Holloway jump. The heavy thud of the leather-bound ledger hitting the wood echoed off the high, plaster ceiling, cutting through the murmurs of the courtroom like a gunshot. Judge Holloway slammed his gavel down, not to restore order, but out of pure shock, his face flushing a mottled shade of crimson. "Mr. Miller, you cannot simply march into a probate hearing and introduce unverified evidentiary material without prior motion or filing," Holloway barked, pointing a thick finger at me. "Mr. Henderson, what is the meaning of this disruption?" Henderson had already discarded his polite smile. He was leaning forward over his table, his eyes locked onto the worn leather cover of the ledger resting on my desk as if he were staring at a live grenade. "Your Honor, the individual is presenting personal effects from an unverified estate inventory," Henderson said, his voice tightening slightly around the edges. "The bank holds the clear, unencumbered tax lien on the property at Maple Street, dating back to the late municipal realignment of '98. Whatever he has in that book is historical garbage meant to stall legal proceedings." "Historical garbage?" I stepped forward, unzipping the front pocket of my backpack and pulling out my father's stacked letters alongside the crisp, purple-stamped notary documents from 1931. "Is that what you call the original land trust covenants signed by your grandfather, Mr. Henderson? The ones proving that the Ashwood Savings and Trust systematically seized 34 homesteads by falsifying foreclosure dates during the Depression?" A low murmur rippled through the back of the courtroom. Two elderly townsmen, sitting on the wooden benches, men whose family names were etched on the war, memorials down in the square, straightened up instantly. Judge Holloway leaned back, his expression shifting from irritation to profound unease. He looked down at Henderson, then back at me. "Let me see that ledger, Mr. Miller." I didn't hand it over from across the room. I picked it up, walked right past Henderson's table, ignoring the sharp, venomous glare the bank manager shot my way, and placed the heavy book directly onto the judge's podium. I opened it to the marker my father had left, a yellowed piece of newspaper clipping from the Ashwood Gazette dated October 19th, 1931, detailing a sudden, unexplained, overnight closure of the bank's downtown branch. Holloway adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the onion-skin pages, tracing the cramped, precise signatures of the town councilmen and notaries from nearly a century ago. As his eyes moved down the page, his breath hitched. The heavy silence in the room became absolute. This is the missing trust ledger from the 31 audit," Holloway whispered, more to himself than to the courtroom. He looked up, his gaze fixing sharply on Henderson. "Arthur, is this what your uncle spent 30 years trying to locate?" Henderson's face went completely pale. The corporate armor had completely cracked, revealing a desperate, cornered man beneath. "Your Honor, it's a forgery. A fabricated sentimental artifact designed to blackmail a financial institution," Henderson snapped, his voice rising sharply in pitch. "We move for an immediate contempt of court charge and a writ of seizure for the Miller property." "You can move for whatever you want, Henderson," I said, turning slowly to face him across the aisle, my voice cold and steady. "But you're going to have to explain it to the state attorney general's office, because I've already mailed copies of these documents and my father's journals to the State Financial Oversight Board in Harrisburg." Henderson froze. His jaw dropped slightly, the color draining entirely from his cheeks. Judge Holloway slammed his gavel down once more, this time with absolute authority. "This hearing is adjourned," the judge declared, his voice booming through the room. "Mr. Henderson, you and your legal counsel will remain in this building. Mr. Miller, bring that ledger to my chambers. Now." The heavy mahogany door of Judge Holloway's chambers clicked shut behind us, locking out the frantic whispers of Arthur Henderson and his corporate attorney. In the hallway, the room smelled of old leather-bound case files, furniture polished and stale. Pipe tobacco. A heavy mahogany desk dominated the center of the space, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves packed with dusty legal digests. Judge Holloway walked behind his desk, dropped heavily into his leather swivel chair, and exhaled a long, shaky breath that seemed to deflate 10 years of accumulated political exhaustion. "Sit down, Thomas," the judge said, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. Without looking up, he was already flipping through the onion-skin pages of the 1931 ledger, his fingers tracing the faded purple notary stamps with a mixture of reverence and dread. I didn't sit. I stood by the window, looking out over the town square where the autumn leaves were swirling in the chilly wind. Martha Carter had chosen to wait, outside in the hallway, standing guard like a Victorian sentinel. "Your father was a remarkably stubborn man," Holloway muttered, shaking his head. "Arthur Miller walked into this very room 25 years ago, right after the town council tried to rezone the old mill district, and told me that if the bank ever tried to touch his property, he'd burn their ledger in the town square. I thought he was just an old eccentric venting county grievances. He wasn't venting," I said quietly, turning from the window to face the desk. "He was protecting people, including my mother." Holloway stopped turning pages. He looked up, his heavy-lidded eyes fixing on me with sudden intensity. "Clara, everyone in Ashwood thought she ran off with a truck driver back in '74. Even the sheriff at the time stopped looking. After 3 months, she didn't run off. Henderson's uncle threatened to pin a forged embezzlement charge on her at the bank unless my grandfather handed over the trust deeds." I said, my voice hardening. "My father helped her cross the state line into Pennsylvania, tucked her away in Altoona under her maiden name, and spent the next 42 years playing the neighborhood recluse, so nobody would ever look twice at the Miller family." Holloway rubbed the bridge of his nose, groaning softly. "If this ledger is authentic, and God help us, it looks entirely authentic, the Ashwood savings and trust isn't just facing a civil suit. They're facing a complete asset forfeiture. Every foreclosure they process using these fraudulent boundary overrides for the last 50 years is legally void. Which means," I added, stepping closer to the desk, "the house on Maple Street belongs to my family free and clear, and Henderson's little morning raids and window-breaking antics are finished." Holloway looked down at the ledger, then slowly closed a heavy leather cover. He let out a long breath and looked up at me. "The bank won't go down quietly, Thomas. Henderson has deep roots. But with these documents, you've got them checkmated." The judge stood up, extending a hand across the desk. "Filed a formal counterclaim with my clerk by 4 o'clock. I'll sign the injunction dismissing the bank's petition immediately." I shook his hand, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of a 50-year-old war finally coming to an end. 10 minutes later, Martha and I walked out of the municipal building and back into the crisp afternoon air. The tension that had gripped my chest since I first stepped foot onto the porch of Maple Street had vanished, replaced by an unfamiliar, sweeping wave of clarity. "Well," Martha asked, leaning heavily on her cane as we reached my truck, "did Holloway do the right thing, or is it going to fold like a cheap card table?" "He signed the injunction," I said, opening the driver's side door. "The house is safe, Martha, and the bank is done." Martha let out a sharp, triumphant laugh that echoed off the brick storefronts of Main Street. "Your old man is smiling from the other side right now." We drove back to Maple Street in a companionable silence. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the overgrown lawn. I walked Martha safely to her front porch across the street, watching as she unlocked her door with a steady hand. "You're not done yet, Thomas," she said, pausing on her threshold and looking back at me with knowing glint in her eye. "You read your father's letters. You found the ledger. Now what are you going to do about Altoona?" I stood on her sidewalk, the cool wind brushing past my jacket, the weight of the question settling deep into my bones. Altoona was only an hour and a half down the turnpike. My mother was out there, living a quiet life under the name Miller-less Hayes, completely unaware that the ghost she left behind 42 years ago had finally been laid to rest. "I'm going for a drive," I said softly. Martha smiled, nodded once, and stepped inside her house, closing the door with a gentle click. I walked back across the street to my truck, climbing into the driver's seat and turning the key. The engine purred to life, heating the cab as I shifted into drive. Just as I was about to pull away from the curb, something caught my eye. In the passenger side footwell, a small, square envelope that must have slipped out of the cedar compartment during the chaos of the morning. It wasn't part of the bundle. It didn't have a date from the 70s. It was clean, white, and sealed with a fresh drop of red wax. My name was written across the front in a handwriting that wasn't my father's and wasn't my mother's. It was a hand I had never seen before. "Thomas Miller. Don't leave Ashwood until you check the western well." I stared down at the crisp, white envelope resting on the rubber floor mat, the red wax seal catching the dim amber glow of the dashboard lights. The engine of my truck hummed a steady, low rhythm, the heater gently blowing warm air against my shins, but a sudden, icy draft seemed to cut right through the glass. "Don't leave Ashwood until you check the western well." It was written with a clean, modern ballpoint pen beneath the dramatic red wax seal, a stark contrast to the yellowed architectural ink of my father's 40-year-old letters. I cut the engine. The sudden silence inside the cab was deafening. Slowly, I reached down, picked up the envelope, and slid my thumb under the wax. Flap. It gave way with a crisp, dry snap. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph and a folded slip of lined notebook paper. I pulled out the photograph first. It had been taken only a few days ago, judging by the digital timestamp fading into the bottom corner. It showed the moss-covered stone rim of the old western well behind my father's house, the very one my grandfather had dug back in the 30s, the one 60 feet deep that supposedly held nothing more than groundwater and old fieldstones, except a heavy concrete lid, which my father and I had welded shut with steel. Rebar back when I was a teenager to keep stray animals from falling in, was rolled completely to one side. A thick nylon rope vanished down into the black, yawning mouth of the shaft. My heart hammered against my ribs. I unfolded the slip of notebook paper and read the hurried handwriting. "Your father didn't hide the ledger at the bottom of the floorboards. Thomas, that was just a decoy for Henderson. The real documents, and what your mother left behind before she crossed the state line, are down in the dry cistern, and someone else is down there right now." No signature. I didn't hesitate. I threw open the truck door, vaulted out onto the gravel of Maple Street, and sprinted across the overgrown lawn toward the back of the house. The autumn twilight was casting long, indigo shadows across the yard, turning the gnarled branches of the old apple trees into twisting skeletons against the fading sky. When I reached the western side of the house, hidden behind a thick wall of overgrown lilac bushes, the truth hit me with sickening clarity. The heavy concrete well lid, the one sealed with reinforced steel, had been dragged completely off its track. A portable generator hummed quietly in the high weeds, its cord running down into the dark stone opening of the well. Beside it sat a heavy-duty industrial winch, its metal gears spinning slowly as weight was pulled upward from the depths below. I crept forward, keeping low behind the lilac bushes, my breath pluming white in the freezing air. As I reached the stone rim of the well, A metallic clink echoed from deep, underground, followed by the sound of sharp, breathless gasp. "I've got the box," a muffled voice called up from the dark, cavernous depths of the cistern, and I found her lockbox, too, tossed down the second hook. I peered over the mossy stone edge into the pitch-black void, shining a beam of light straight down my phone. The glare caught the face of a man looking wildly, up toward the surface. Not a bank lackey, but Arthur Henderson himself, his expensive suit ruined with mud and slime, holding a rusted iron box against his chest, and standing right beside him, in the damp stone chamber at the bottom of the, holding a flashlight with a steady, unyielding hand, was a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that I hadn't seen in a mirror for 40 years. "Drop the box, Arthur." A voice rang out clear, sharp, and carrying an absolute, unshakable authority that froze the man in his tracks. It wasn't my voice. It was a woman standing beside him at the bottom of the dry cistern. My mother, Clara. She hadn't just been trapped down there. She had been standing, guard over whatever secrets the well had held for half a century, waiting for the exact moment the trap finally closed on the men who tried to steal her family's history. Henderson's face went slack, the rusted iron box trembling in his mud-stained hands as he looked down at her in absolute disbelief. "Clara? How the hell are you? You were supposed to be in Altoona for 40 years. People stay where they're told to stay when they're protecting what matters." "Arthur," Clara said, stepping smoothly into the beam of light, her eyes flashing, with a fierce, quiet intelligence. "My husband spent 50 years guarding this town from thieves like your grandfather, and you really thought you could just waltz in with a forged tax lien and dig up my life." From my vantage point at the top of the stone rim, my breath caught in my throat. I leaned further over the edge, the cold, damp air rushing up from the earth. "Mom," I called out, my voice cracking slightly across the quiet evening yard. Down in the darkness, the flashlight beam snapped upward, cutting through the damp air and blinded me for a fraction of a second. Then the beam settled on my face. The woman's breath hitched, the stern, defensive posture she had held against. Henderson melted away in an instant, replaced by a raw, overwhelming wave of recognition. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice echoing off the ancient stone walls. "My God, look at you. You have your father's eyes. Get out of the well, both of you." I called down, my hand gripping my phone, tightly as I reached for the manual brake lever of the industrial winch sitting beside the generator. "Henderson, drop the box and start climbing the ladder. Right now. Or I cut the winch cable and leave you down there with the rats until the sheriff arrives." Henderson looked up at me, panic and fury warring across his mud-streaked face. For a second, I thought he might try to run deeper into the old drainage tunnels that branched off the cistern. But the sound of distant police sirens suddenly, wailing down Maple Street, a welcome echo of Martha Carter's swift phone call to the county sheriff, shattered any remaining delusions he had about escaping. "Damn you all," Henderson spat out, dropping the rusted iron box with a heavy, echoing thud against the stone floor of the cistern. He grabbed the rungs of the iron ladder bolted into the side of the well shaft and began frantically climbing upward. I didn't help him. When his head cleared the stone rim, I grabbed him by the collar of his ruined, expensive suit, hauled him bodily over the edge of the grass like a sack of wet flour, and shoved him down hard onto the damp earth. He lay there coughing, completely defeated, staring up at the flashing red and blue lights of 2 sheriff cruisers pulling onto the gravel driveway. I turned back to the dark opening of the well, my heart hammering against my ribs, and dropped the heavy nylon loop of the winch line straight down into the blackness. "Mom," I said, my voice thick with emotion as I gripped the heavy metal crank. "Grab the line. Let's bring you home." The heavy steel cable of the winch grew taut as the mechanical gears ground and turned, pulling the weight upward from the damp, forgotten depths of the cistern. I kept my hand locked firmly on the iron crank, my muscles burning with every rotation, until a pair of leather-soled boots finally appeared over the dark stone rim of the well. My mother stepped out into the cool evening air, shaking off a light dusting of gray stone dust from the shoulders of her wool coat. She looked older, certainly. The lines around her eyes mapped a life of decades lived in quiet exile, but the fierce, unyielding posture of Miller was entirely intact. Sirens wailed to a sharp halt at the edge of the gravel drive, their red and blue strobes painting the peeling Victorian siding of the house in erratic flashes of light. Deputy Sheriff Miller, no relation, though a distant cousin of half the county, stepped out of the lead cruiser, his hand resting instinctively on his holster as he took in the bizarre scene. Arthur Henderson sprawled in the mud, gasping for air, the open well shaft, and my mother standing beside me on the grass. "Well, I'll be damned," the deputy muttered, lowering his hand as he walked over. "Clara, everyone in town thought you vanished off the face of the earth back in '74. "I was right where I needed to be, deputy," Clara said smoothly, her voice steady and clear. She reached out her hand, warm and lined, bearing the exact same shape of knuckles as my own, resting gently against my cheek. She looked into my eyes, her own welling with unshed tears. "And your father kept his promise. He kept this family safe until you were strong enough to finish what we started. By midnight, the municipal building was a beehive of emergency legal activity. Judge Holloway had returned to his chambers under a midnight court order, flanked by state investigators. The rusted iron box Clara had pulled from the cistern contained not only the true, unredacted land trust deeds of Ashwood from 1931, but also the original signed confessions of Samuel Henderson's grandfather, admitting to the systematic fabrication of fraudulent foreclosures during the Great Depression. Arthur Henderson was let out of the municipal offices in handcuffs, his expensive suit stained with well water and mud, his career and family legacy dismantled in a single evening. The Ashwood Savings and Trust was placed under immediate state receivership, its assets frozen pending a full restitution audit that would finally return the historic deeds back to families who had lost their homes nearly a century ago. The next morning, the sun broke over Ashwood with a brilliant, golden clarity that washed away the chill of the previous days. I stood on the front porch of the Maple Street house. The broken front window had been temporarily boarded up, but the rest of the house stood tall, solid, and quiet against the autumn breeze. Inside, the cedar compartment of the floorboard was empty now, its secrets safely handed over to the state, the ledger no longer a weapon of blackmail, but a monument to justice. Clara sat inside at the kitchen table, wrapping her hands around a hot mug of coffee, looking out at the maple tree her husband had planted the year I was born. The ghost of the past had finally been laid to rest. The town of Ashwood would wake up to a very different world this morning, one where the ledger was finally balanced. I walked back inside, closing the front door behind me, feeling a deep, abiding peace settle into my chest. But as I turned to join my mother in the kitchen, my boot clipped the edge of the braided rug near the hallway, scraping against something metallic tucked deep underneath the baseboard. Something small, flat, and entirely overlooked. I knelt down, sliding my fingers beneath the worn fabric, and pulled out a single, forgotten brass key stamped with a faded number, 402. There was no note attached, no explanation, just an old key to a safety deposit box at a bank 2 counties over that no longer existed on any modern map.